Few stories in horror have left a legacy as profound as Stephen King's classic The Shining, and few adaptations have divided audiences as sharply as the two we are looking at today. Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film is a cornerstone of cinematic horror, hailed as a masterpiece for its unforgettable imagery, psychological depth and haunting ambiguity. It's a film that has stood the test of time, commonly cited as one of the greatest horror films ever made. But in 1997, Stephen King, unhappy with the Kubrick's take on his novel, offered his own vision, a miniseries adaptation that promised to stay faithful to the source material. King's version had its own goals, its own tone, and its own approach to the story of Jack Torrance and the Overlook Hotel. Two adaptations, two vastly different takes. One the work of a cinematic auteur, the other a deeply personal response from the man who wrote the story. Their histories are inseparably tied to this tension, and together they form a fascinating case study of what happens when two creative minds collide. But can they both coexist? And does the often panned 1997 miniseries have what it takes to step out of the shadow of its masterpiece predecessor? This is the tale of two Shinings. The story of The Shining begins with Stephen King's 1977 novel, a deeply personal work inspired by his own struggles with alcoholism and a stay at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado. Nestled in the mountains, the Stanley was eerily empty during King's visit, and its isolation sparked the idea for the Overlook Hotel. Combined with King's own fears of hurting his family during a turbulent period in his life, the novel became a haunting exploration of addiction, family, and looming supernatural evil. After the major success of the book, it was no surprise that Hollywood came knocking. Stanley Kubrick, fresh off Barry Lyndon and now bored, wanted to try something new. Kubrick was notoriously choosy about his films, meticulously combing through piles of novels until he found one that resonated. Legend has it that he chose The Shining after throwing King's manuscript across the room, only to pick it up later and decide it had something going for it. Kubrick saw The Shining as an opportunity to blend his love of psychological complexity with the visceral thrill of horror. He viewed the Overlook Hotel not just as a haunted location, but as a surreal, almost malevolent force, warping the minds of its occupants. The 1980 adaptation became a passion project, with Kubrick personally reworking the script, much to King's frustration.
And there are an awful lot of things about that movie that I think are flawless and beautiful and just marvelous. And then there are other times when I feel as though I'd given Stanley Kubrick a live grenade and he heroically threw his body on it.
A beautiful Cadillac without an engine. Kubrick even changed the color of the VW Beetle to yellow instead of red as in the original novel, and while Halloran makes his return to the Overlook, he sees a crushed red Beetle. This had to have been less than a subtle screw you pointed towards the famous writer. By the mid-1990s, King finally had a chance to reclaim his story. Teaming up with ABC, he wrote and produced a 3-part miniseries adaptation. This version was a deliberate correction, faithful to the novel in almost every way. It retained Jack Torrance's humanity, focused on his tragic gradual downfall, and expanded on the Overlook's history and supernatural presence. While watching the miniseries, one might suspect it was done with a small budget, which just isn't so. A completely respectable $21 million were invested into the project, ironically a bit more what Kubrick had in 1980, not counting for inflation. That budget is in the territory of 90s classics like Toy Story and Seven, and even longer format films like Shawshank Redemption and Dances with Wolves. With money, his own creativity, and the will to make things right, King now had the tools to make it happen.
Stephen King, the master of terror and suspense, invites you to begin a journey to a place where fear never dies.
Everything worth saying about the Kubrick movie has probably already been said, and plenty more at that. So to keep this video in a more manageable format, the following chapters will be focused on the more unknown miniseries. But let's quickly tackle the obvious 1980 elephant in the room. Stanley Kubrick was the driving force, his meticulous approach shaping every frame of the film. Jack Nicholson's portrayal of Jack Torrance has become iconic, a larger-than-life performance brimming with madness and menace. Shelley Duvall, though often overshadowed in discussions, delivered a vulnerable and human portrayal of Wendy Torrance, enduring not only the Overlook's horrors but Kubrick's infamous on-set behavior, out of which Scatman Crothers as Dick Halloran also got his part. Then there's Danny Lloyd, whose portrayal of Danny Torrance remains one of the most memorable child performances in horror. Just 6 years old during filming, Lloyd balanced the innocence of a child with the eerie wisdom of someone shining. And of course there's the technical crew like the legendary cinematographer and Kubrick regular John Alcott, whose Steadicam work revolutionized visual storytelling. But let's turn our attention to the 1997 miniseries, beginning with its director Mick Garris. A frequent collaborator of Stephen King, Garris had already directed King's The Stand and Sleepwalkers. Garris approached The Shining with a steady hand, placing the story and the characters above visual experimentation. His direction wasn't flashy but intentional, ensuring that King's vision was the star of the show. The cast too reflected this commitment to King's story. Steven Weber, best known at the time for his work on Wings, brought an entirely different energy to Jack Torrance. His portrayal started with warmth and humanity, showing Jack as a man battling his inner demons, mainly alcoholism and violent streaks that came with it. Rebecca De Mornay delivered a strong, assertive Wendy Torrance. A far cry from Shelley Duvall's portrayal, De Mornay's Wendy fought tooth and nail to protect her family, embodying the resilience King had envisioned for the character. Meanwhile, Cortland Mead played Danny Torrance with innocence and vulnerability, though comparisons to Danny Lloyd's haunting performance in the 1980 film were unavoidable. Melvin Van Peebles brought warmth to Dick Halloran, stepping into a role that was more substantial than in Kubrick's version. Halloran's deeper connection to the Overlook and his mentoring of Danny were given more room to breathe, aligning closely with King's novel. And then there was Stephen King himself. As both writer and an active producer, King's presence was felt throughout the miniseries because of his vast creative control. From crafting the script to shaping performances, he was determined to bring his story to life in his own terms. With a trusted director, a passionate if modest cast, and King's guiding hand, the 1997 miniseries brought together all the elements for a faithful retelling. Whether those elements were enough to step out of the 1980 version's long shadow is a question we will continue to explore. The production of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining has become the stuff of legend, as much a part of the film's mystique as the movie itself. Kubrick was notorious for his perfectionism, often demanding dozens or even hundreds of takes to get a single scene just right. Shelley Duvall in particular bore the brunt of his intensity, with her performances as Wendy Torrance famously requiring over 120 takes in the baseball bat scene alone.
No desperation. Oh, come on. What do you mean roll video? We're killing ourselves out here and you're going to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing
So we
right
play
by
mood
the
music?
door.
The grueling approach wasn't limited to the actors. The crew too faced relentless demands to meet Kubrick's exacting standards. The Overlook Hotel's unforgettable interiors were painstakingly constructed on sound stages at Elstree Studios in England. Inspired by the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite, the production team created a space that felt simultaneously grand and claustrophobic, blending luxury with foreboding. Kubrick's use of Steadicam captured the Overlook's labyrinthine halls with fluidity that mirrored the story's psychological descents. The result was a visual masterpiece, though the production left many involved physically and emotionally drained. Now let's turn to the 1997 miniseries. A production was more modest in scale. Unlike Kubrick, King insisted on authenticity and emotional fidelity to his novel, starting with the location. The miniseries was filmed on location at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, the very place that had inspired The Shining in the first place. This gave the production a sense of authenticity that King felt Kubrick's studio-built Overlook perhaps lacked. However, shooting on location came with its challenges. The Stanley Hotel was an active business, which meant filming had to work around the guests and the staff, adding logistical hurdles. Budget constraints meant that the elaborate set pieces were rare, and some of the supernatural elements like the topiary animals and the infamous fire hose relied on dated CGI that hasn't aged gracefully. Jack Torrance, a struggling writer and recovering alcoholic, accepts a job as a winter caretaker of the isolated Overlook Hotel in Colorado. He moves in with his wife Wendy and their psychic son Danny, hoping the solitude will help him focus on his writing and rebuild his fractured family. Danny possesses a powerful ability known as the Shining, which allows him to see past and future events as well as communicate telepathically with others who have the same gift. Before leaving for Florida, the hotel's cook Dick Halloran warns Danny to stay away from a certain room and be cautious of the hotel's dark history. As winter sets in, the hotel's supernatural forces begin manipulating Jack, preying on his insecurities, past traumas, and his addiction to alcohol. Jack slowly descends into madness, pushed by the hotel's malevolent spirit, which often manifests as deceased former guests and staff. Danny, meanwhile, experiences terrifying visions of the hotel's past horrors, as his psychic powers keep feeding the hotel and slowly bringing it back to life. Wendy grows increasingly concerned as Jack's behavior becomes more erratic and violent. She fails to contain him, and Jack eventually succumbs completely to the hotel's influence and turns on his family, pursuing them through the hotel wielding a two-handed weapon.
Here's Johnny!
Dick Halloran rushes back to the hotel only to be struck down by the mad caretaker. Jack ultimately fails at his attempt and loses his life in the process, allowing Danny and Wendy to make their escape from the Overlook with a snowcat.
Go check it out!
I've seen Kubrick's The Shining at least a dozen times, but I never really planned on reviewing it. Much smarter, more competent people than me have already done it, some even to excess. If you haven't seen Room 237, you really should. It's a mind-bending deep dive into the obsessive interpretations people can come up with. As for me, I don't have anything new to add. The movie is a visual masterpiece and, in my opinion, the most cinematographically stunning horror film ever made. Watching it now on 4K is almost a transcendent experience. The only real criticism I have is that the pacing always felt rushed and abrupt, especially if you've read the book. It's not a movie you just throw on casually, it's something you watch in a certain mood. It's unsettling, uncomfortable, and I always get the same eerie, creeping bad mood I feel when watching Angel Heart or Martyrs. The miniseries is a different beast entirely. Now, if you judge the miniseries by classic hard factors, cinematography, editing, sound design, acting, effects, direction, it doesn't even come close to Kubrick's version. It's visually unimpressive, bland, some of the acting is just off, the kid is cringy, the CGI horrendous, and the sound design is completely forgettable. It's worse in almost every way. And I absolutely love it. This has been one of my guilty pleasures since I was a teenager. Scratch that, I refuse to call it a guilty pleasure anymore. Just like Kubrick's version, I watch it when I'm in a very specific mood, except the complete opposite mood. Where Kubrick's film is intense, challenging, and leaves much room for interpretation, the miniseries is the easiest viewing experience imaginable. It doesn't engage you, challenge you, or ask you to interpret anything. Everything is laid out through exposition, and all you have to do is to keep your eyes open and breathe. And honestly, it's not even scary, not in the least. Unless, of course, you're scared of CGI fire hoses or hedge animals or these terrifying ghosts. Now, for an amateur dilettante film critic's output, that might sound like an insult, but I genuinely mean it in the best way possible. When I wake up with a pounding hangover, or I'm stuck in bed with a bad flu trying to survive the first few hours before I feel remotely human again, this is the movie I watch. Imagine coming home from a long, exhausting week and your significant other has just pulled a fresh batch of warm cinnamon buns out of the oven. You wrap yourself in a cozy blanket and take a bite. That's the miniseries. It goes down as easily as chocolate pudding. Does the miniseries do anything better? Well, yes it does. The longer miniseries format gives the story so much more room to breathe and fleshes out the book's details in the way that Kubrick's film never could. It dives deeper into the hotel's history, explores Jack's inner demons and never feels rushed. And here's a controversial opinion. I think Steven Weber is a better Jack Torrance than Jack Nicholson. Okay, put the pitchforks down, hear me out. Jack Nicholson is a fantastic actor and I really love him, but he's also an actor who plays a very specific kind of role better than anyone else. And let's be honest, you need to be a little crazy to play crazy that well. The role of insane Jack Torrance was tailor-made for Nicholson. The problem is, he's not good at playing regular Jack Torrance. Even in the scene when he's just sitting in the Beetle with his family, he already feels off. It's like he already has one hand on that axe handle while making casual conversation.
See? It's okay. You saw it on the television.
Then they check into the hotel and before you know it...
He's mad. He's mad! He's madder than Mad Jack McMad, the winner of last year's Mr. Madman competition.
Weber, on the other hand, does a great job portraying normal, struggling Jack Torrance before his descents. He plays a man desperately trying to keep himself together, and because of his descent is more gradual, I actually sympathize with him. Also, Rebecca de Mornay's Wendy is portrayed in a more believable fashion, and her protectiveness over Danny is apparent from the start. So, can both versions peacefully coexist? Absolutely, they should coexist, they must coexist. Despite sharing the same name and source material, they are so far removed from each other that they should be treated as completely separate works. Kubrick's movie is haute cuisine, it's your fine dining, Michelin-starred excellence. It's caviar on artisanal crackers served in a 3-star restaurant. The miniseries? It's one of these. A fast food chain mega burger. Sloppy, mass-produced, lukewarm and bland. And somehow still amazing. Kubrick's film is like listening to Bach from a vinyl through handcrafted tube amps with high-end speakers. The miniseries is a Jimmy Buffett mixtape, played from that thrift store boombox your dad used to keep in his garage. And there's nothing wrong with either. I've seen the miniseries way more times than the Kubrick version, and I've eaten way more hamburgers than lobster thermidor. It's okay to like both, they scratch completely different itches. I feel the same way about Rose Red, which came out 5 years later, but I never see anybody talking about that movie. Similar format, similar production values, and it has really grown on me. It's not great horror, but a great story that scratches the same itch. If you can find it, give it a shot. Your opinion of it will likely match your opinion of the Shining miniseries. So, which version is better? There's no real answer I can give you. One is objectively superior in almost every way, but I still find myself popping the old miniseries DVD 3 or 4 times a year. It's all about the mood you're in. Are you looking for artistic thrills or pure comforts? All I know is whenever I wake up with a headache from hell and I see that red Beetle driving towards Overlook, I just sit there and stand in awe. Well, sit in awe, or lay in awe. Can you even lay in awe outside stargazing or amazing sex? Comment down below. I will be back sometime with something else.